All right. Well, thank you all for inviting me to be here today. And I am excited to talk about some of the work that I have been doing and how it has informed the work that I am currently doing, and confirming that you can still hear me okay, and that it's okay for us to record. Okay. Thank you, Rose, for recording. I appreciate that. So today I plan to talk about what will start as parent socialization to adversity management and then become a bit broader. And so my background, if you will, is a combination of developmental and social personality, as well as community. So my prior work really looked at identity and its roots, developing in adolescence, actually before adolescence, but how parents and family inform the development and formation of identity and identity beliefs for their children. And in that work, I was especially interested in how children and young adults come to believe what they believe about what it means to be in the skin that they're in. So many of the questions that we asked were about their experiences and their perception of being in the skin that they were in, their parents' perceptions, and what they thought was important to share with their child to prepare them for their lived experiences as a minoritized person. I couple that with study designs that are designed to include the voices of those on the fringes, those who we traditionally maybe don't survey as much or don't hear from as much. And one of the studies for me that represented this well was a study that was done a few years ago. I was interested in recruiting Black and Latinx young adults to better understand how their lived experiences informed their overall well-being and health behaviors. But unlike the majority of what we know about these populations in young adulthood, I really wanted to hear from those who were not currently enrolled in college. And so we created this study design whereby we were recruiting at venues that had higher likelihood of having Black and Latinx emerging adults. So we were at malls, we surveyed barbershops. We surveyed a lot of different areas in identifying the venues with the highest likelihood of having the population we were interested in, and learned a ton from that experience. You know, most notably, it was so rewarding to be in a space where you would have young adults come up to you and I'd say, have you ever done a survey before? And they'd say, oh, you know, one participant told me, oh, yes, I have. I took one of the surveys that you get when you call into Sprint. And it was eye-opening because, you know, when we think about college student population, we think about a population that frequently has their voice represented, though in this presentation, I'm going to talk about ways in which there's still a lot that we have yet to learn about emerging adults, especially those from minoritized backgrounds. So that's a bit of the work that I've done to date. And I'm going to start by talking about lessons from that past work and go into a recent project that's looked at coping with race-related adversity within emerging adulthood, and then talk about a current project that I'm really excited about that's evolving into a longitudinal study looking at multidimensional adversity and the role it plays in persistence for STEM majors. So way back when, as in March of 2020, when I was giving a talk, I would reference media images like this to help give folks a sense of, discourse within Black media outlets and what was salient, what was on the minds of people and what they were thinking about. And it's just So interesting how radically different and how exponential the examples have become, where these were some of the examples from early 2020, mostly from the media movies that highlighted significant figures and unjust systems, and even things pulled from fantasy that were empowering for minoritized groups. Flash now to now in 2021, and we have a multitude of examples of things that are important in the lives of emerging adults generally and emerging adults across diverse backgrounds. And you've lived through it with me, so you know many of the and recognize many of these examples. And I think what's so telltale here is how these experiences have and will continue to inform the trajectories of persistence, the not just the feelings of, but the actual persistence of emerging adults from minoritized backgrounds in our educational system. So I'll highlight, there are so many examples here, but two that you'll see me emphasize in the work that I talk about today are race-related adversity experiences, so race-related hardship. And here I'm including experiences related to direct race-related trauma, vicarious experiences, direct experiences of discrimination, microaggressions. And the other pocket you'll hear me talk about are household dependence and family-related stress, of which there are many, many examples of and was completely exacerbated by the pandemic, but manifested in lots of different ways for students, particularly the population that I'm interested in, because family structure is so diverse with this population. So while there are many, many different priorities and examples that came out during this past year and a half, 2 years, those are the two that I'm going to emphasize for the sake of the talk. And I want to contextualize this by talking about young adulthood generally, which, when we put this in a developmental context, emerging adulthood is an incredibly important developmental period. It is a sensitive health period. This is where we see a shift more recently in the emerging adults who are moving back home or never leaving home. So we see more frequent dynamics between family members and emerging adults that are extending past 19 than we have in the past and previous years, where it was formerly thought at 18 you're an adult and now you're doing something independent. Parent influence has stopped. We're seeing a real potential for intergenerational transmission of parenting and the communication of what's healthy related to experiences that emerging adults have in this season of life. Many of those experiences now pull from the examples that I just talked about on the previous slide. In a Institute of Medicine report, there was an emphasis on family remaining the central relationship context, even in young adulthood, which again is a bit of a shift from decades past, where we've thought about the family as influential until emerging adulthood. And there was also an emphasis on disadvantaged experiences, that is hardship and adversity, and how they're associated with declines in mental health. So we can think about emerging adulthood as reflecting, in one sense, it's the culmination of a trajectory from infancy through middle childhood, adolescence, into emerging adulthood. But in many ways, it's the start or the continuation of another trajectory now, this lengthy period we call adulthood. And it's the stepping stone for the practices, the coping strategies, the health management strategies that a person will use likely throughout the duration of their adulthood. It also postures them for a set of experiences that they will now have to be prepared for to navigate as an adult, so independent of family in ways that they may not have had to navigate before. These are all factors that played a role in the development of this first study that I'll talk about, where the emphasis was on understanding discrimination as part of this general life course experience. And we know that experiences and beliefs of the parent inform their parenting, which is the hallmark of Belsky's parenting theory. We also know that discrimination focused socialization is socialization where a parent may talk about the types of adversity the child will experience because of the skin they're in. And it can manifest in a couple of different ways. Coping socialization where the child is told to address it directly, pay attention, don't ignore it, but that might come with some instructions on how to do it, or it might be in the absence of instructions. Oftentimes, parents bring up these messages in response to something that the emerging adult, in this case, has come home and talked to them about. And this is important because it's the hardship or adversity that is considered to be part of the normal experience for many emerging adults of color. And so in that way, when we look at resilience or attempt to understand resilience in minoritized emerging adult communities, we need to see this as significant adversity and then examine some of the positive adaptation that is occurring within this context. Two theories that are also relevant in this conversation are that of Garcia Cole and Murray, who both offer culturally tailored theories of ecological models, Bronfenbrenner's theory that I'll talk about a little bit later, that are tailored for child and emerging adult development. So in this study, we were interested in looking at racial discrimination as a stressor, how it impacted psychological health for emerging adults, and then really was influenced by positive appraisal and coping that collectively would create this context for positive adaptation. Since we cannot completely eliminate this hardship, what we consider to be fostering healthy development for minoritized emerging adults is in changing what's amenable to change, this middle part here. So coping generally is defined as the thoughts and behaviors that a person uses to deal with stressful situations. And for the purpose of this project, I focus specifically on approach coping. That is when parents were talking about tackling the unfair experience directly, acknowledging it, taking it on, not minimizing it, not ignoring it. And while approach coping has been studied exhaustively in the broader literature, there are actually very few studies, just a handful, that look at approach coping socialization in response to experiences of racism, which could manifest really differently. There are different sets of concerns with respect to problem solving or taking direct action in response to a racism experience. And so there are two types of ethnic racial approach coping socialization that we looked at in the study. One was problem focused and the other was support focused. So the question was, does coping socialization moderate the discrimination well-being association? Here we're looking at well-being holistically amongst emerging adults. So it was expected that what this pocket that you saw as discrimination was looked at as microaggressions, and it was expected that it would be associated with lower well-being. We also expected that, mindset, I should say as well, because I also looked at mindset here. It was expected that ethnic racial approach coping socialization would be associated with higher well-being. So the more likely parents were to encourage their emerging adult to tackle the unfair experience directly, the aftermath of it directly, to consider how to problem solve and strategize around it, the higher the emerging adult's overall well-being. And then we were interested in whether the approach coping would moderate that link. So at low levels of approach coping, microaggressions were expected to be associated with lower well-being, but then at high levels, the strength of the microaggression well-being link would be mitigated a bit. So there would be some benefit to higher levels of approach coping. This came from a sample of Black emerging adults in a college setting. So we recruited through subject pool for this, and typical of subject pool was mostly female, age range fitting within emerging adulthood, mostly never married. And then a real range in terms of parental, marital status, work status, living arrangements, and economic background. So also another outcome that was of interest here was growth mindset. And this, I expanded the study to include to understand if approach coping served a different role, if it was psychological well-being versus something academic. So growth mindset here is the extent to which intelligence is perceived to be malleable. And the three items we used are we use three items to capture this. One example is you have a certain amount of intelligence and you really cannot do much to change it. And so part of the impetus for understanding this was, after repeated experiences of unfair treatment, are you more likely to lock yourself into a belief pattern where you just feel like you can't change things and things are the way that they are? Racial ethnic microaggressions was a composite score reflecting on the past 6 months and included several different examples of discrimination. And I should note that theoretically there are different reasons for having these subscores to them. For the purpose of the study, we were just going to focus on this microaggressions generally. And then we also looked at race-related coping, which is our measure of approach coping. So participants were asked to read each item and indicate whether their parents instructed them to do each in response to an event reflecting racism, which makes this different from a general coping measure. Problem coping, you can see, is focused on standing one's ground, being aware of what has to be done, and doubling efforts. It's very action-directed. Seeking social support is also action-directed, but in a different approach. Talking to someone, finding out more, asking a relative, asking for advice. And this one, my parent told me to pray, oddly enough, was the one with the highest mean in this particular sample. So it's a common go-to that many emerging adults reported. And some background questions that we used as covariates. So I want to transition now and, of course, I talked about growth, mindset, well-being was the other outcome of interest. And it's got several different dimensions to it, but here we looked at it holistically. Overall, the results show that well-being was higher for Black young adults with fewer microaggressions, which is very consistent with the existing literature. It was also associated with a greater sense of closeness to parents. So emerging adults who had higher well-being also reported feeling closer to their parent and greater attachment to their racial group, which is encouraging. It shows us that irrespective of a person's frequency of experiences with unfair treatment, if they feel attached to their racial group membership, there's a higher likelihood that they have an overall higher sense of well-being, psychological well-being. We did see somewhat of some gender differences in the types of coping that families provided, with females receiving slightly more problem-focused coping than males. and slightly more support coping than males as well. The support coping, I think, is far more intuitive than maybe the problem focused coping. But I have some thoughts on why there might be differences there, and you may as well. That could be interesting to look at. Okay, so I want to stop sharing, then I'll have to reshare so I can. Okay. So I want to jump to some of the interactions that we found. One that was particularly interesting, and this is around this link between inferiority microaggressions. This is one dimension of microaggressions and overall well-being. And what's unique about inferiority microaggressions is that they are the experiences that the emerging adult may have had that conveyed that others assumed they were inferior for some reason. Could have been in terms of their intelligence, could have been just overall as a person. But what's unique about inferiority microaggressions is that there are a few items in there that are really specific to the academic context, and that was interesting to me. So we can see that individuals who endorsed low support coping overall, for individuals who endorse lower support coping, inferiority microaggressions are associated with low levels of well-being. And we can see that for individuals who endorse high support coping, this relationship is mitigated a bit so that well-being is not quite as depressed as it is in the context of low support coping. We would not have expected this red line to be drastically different because, again, it is this association between experiencing microaggressions and one's overall sense of well-being. And the literature tells us there's a long-standing and lots of evidence that there's a negative relationship, right? The more discrimination you experience, the lower your overall well-being. So that pattern emerges as true here, but also we're seeing somewhat of a buffering effect of the social support coping, which is really encouraging, especially because this is specific to racial adversity management. This is not general coping. This is what your parents have told you specifically in response to an experience with racism as an emerging adult.
Ciara, I had a quick question about the scale of the microaggressions.
Of the microaggressions, you want me to go back to that? Let's see.
It was on the graph you were showing. It looked like it was scaled from 0 to 1. No.
Yep. Yeah, and that's 0. No, they have not experienced it, to 1. Yes, they have experienced it. There are some from the camp who would use a sum score. I'm not a fan of that when it comes to experiences of unfair treatment because it can exacerbate frequency in ways that are not really reflective of an experience, right? So you wind up getting a score that reflects heterogeneity and not necessarily frequency, if that makes sense. You can wind up getting, if you use sum instead of mean, you can wind up getting a higher score if you've had more diverse unfair experiences that may not reflect the frequency if you've just had a lot of one kind of experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting measurement problem. I can understand why you're doing that.
Yeah. So in this case, I stuck with the mean, and that's why you see the scale score of 0 to 1. So it's on average.
Oh, but just now you took it in a different direction than I was expecting because the mean and the sum will still have the same relation to other variables.
This is true, but conceptually, it's a lot easier to interpret this mean, and it's not. And it avoids the problem that I mentioned in the best way possible.
The scale is interpretable, but it doesn't change its participation in a linear model.
Yep, I agree. I agree. And good questions. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay. So some of the takeaways from that, as I mentioned, were what we found was consistent with other work. There's lots of evidence that the more unfair treatment you experience, the poorer the outcomes. What I didn't find at that study was a link to growth mindset. And it was really interesting to me because so many of the items were related to, an assumption of lower intelligence or not being as smart as you are or as intelligent as you are. Or be someone being surprised that you were more intelligent than they assumed you were. So it left me with this box of questions of, a model that might better address that or unpack what happened there. The results also speak to this framework that are created around racism, cultural coping, and health in African American families, where we know that it's very much in part influenced by an individual's life experiences, the context that they're in, as well as factors like their parents' beliefs, which this past study just reported, that influence how the parent responds, how they encourage the child to respond, and ultimately the health of both parties. But I don't see this process as just constrained to health outcomes. As I mentioned, I was really interested in how some aspects of this process, mainly context and these processes, were influencing the participants' academic beliefs as well. And so that led me to go back to Bronfenbrenner's model, and I think this is a point that many of us are already familiar with, so I won't spend too much time on this. Bronfenbrenner's ecological model was our longstanding go-to for understanding ecological influences, and now, as of 2005, has evolved into the PPCT model, which became the foundation for my current project, where I was really interested in students' persistence in STEM and their performance, and seeing these as whether or not they stay in the major, whether or not they are doing well in a STEM major, which includes psychology, and how that is influenced by their experiences with adversity. So I can talk about and how those experiences with adversity and to persistence are then explained through their motivation. So here I had would it be helpful for me to talk about PPCT, or is this something that I think we're all pretty clear about? Well, I'll just talk about it briefly then. Person, here we're talking about specific characteristics of the individual, which includes some of the factors that are of interest to my study, which go beyond a single racial group membership and now look at racial group membership across many different groups, ethnic group membership across many different groups, other characteristics that are unique to the individual. Process, which is the hallmark of this theory, and looks at these interrelated processes between the human and the world that surrounds them, especially that immediate context, that are reliable, they're stable, they're occurring regularly over time. Context, reflecting the micro, meso, macro, exo, macro that we're typically familiar with and think about with Bronfenbrenner. And then time, the importance of how these things change and occur over specific periods, especially the historical period the individual is in. Well, what was fascinating to me and what I wanted to contribute to this literature is really expanding our thoughts about what adversity included. So as I mentioned in the previous project, my work to date had by and large focused on adversity that was related to one's experience being in the skin that they're in. And it also focused on adversity related to their economic background, financial status. And I've expanded this to include a more, what I consider to be a more holistic conceptualization of adversity in order to really unpack how these experiences are happening independent of one another, but then also connected to one another, and how those patterns might be associated with students' motivation, their want to, in terms of staying in the major. This holistic conceptualization includes adversity and hardship related to family experiences, racial and ethnic experiences, past adversity, which historically has been looked at in terms of adverse child experiences, and then institutional. And then I've expanded adversity here really within the context of family in a number of different ways that I find to be exciting, I think are very relevant for the student population that we'll be looking at. Within the context of motivation, I'm using Eccles and Wakefield here to really unpack how students' experiences with adversity expanded are associated with their STEM persistence, as explained through motivation, these motivational characteristics. And this is going to be a longitudinal study, but we did do some pilot work, which I'll talk about quickly. Some of the emerging results from this pilot, which was conducted at a local minority serving institution, was that markers of household dependence, such as COVID-19 interruptions, and those were Pell Grant recipients, were associated with lower GPA. So we're seeing some markers of that household dependence associated with lower GPA. Participants reported their biggest obstacles to graduation to be consistent with what we would expect from the literature, but I think this will be exciting to unpack a bit more. And then notably, experiences with racism and hardship, both in adulthood and childhood, were all associated with lower GPAs. And here's where we can work to better understand how those are functioning independently, how they're functioning interconnectedly as patterns. And that's really going to lay the foundation for this next work. So these multidimensional adversities are independently associated with STEM outcomes. And the next step will be to understand more of this, but then examine when and for whom these experiences will lead to a decline in motivation that has a ripple effect on STEM. And that's essentially where we're going with next steps, to examine these processes, specifically contextualize racial stress and family hardship, and then understanding how they impacted decline in motivation. What I plan to do now, I've just received funding for a 3-year longitudinal project to examine when and how multidimensional adversity is related to STEM persistence and achievement. We'll be doing this work in the context of minority serving institutions, looking at STEM majors, which include psychology, and understanding how motivational declines play a role in the adversity persistence link. There are other hardships that I haven't mentioned just for the sake of time, but those that are of central interest to the project and to my work historically will be unpacking race-related adversity and household-related hardship, and how these processes influence motivation and persistence for emerging adults. So I'll wrap up by acknowledging all the many sources that helped to get this work done. And thank you for allowing me to present today. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Ciara. This was an excellent presentation and overview of the work that you have been doing and what your next steps look like. Do you want to talk a little bit more about those next steps, especially in the context of how you're going to capture the data longitudinally?
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to. So this project is funded by the National Science Foundation, and the goal is to recruit participants from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds over a 3-year period. It's a mixed method longitudinal study. And so we'll be recruiting uh, through courses, through STEM courses, intro STEM courses, because I'm very interested in how this, I dare say starts, because it's not a start, right? And I'm talking to developmentalists, so unless we're in utero, it's not the start. I do understand that, but for the sake of the project, uh, our goal will be first semester freshmen, and looking at their experiences over time. What's fascinating about this to me is there's a way that we've done this in the past where we've assumed, okay, if we're going to examine hardship, we'll just ask them what hardship experiences they've had. But what I really wanted to capture and will capture with this study is how those hardship experiences emerge during the student's college experience, and how those recent hardship experiences might ping motivational shifts for the student in time, across time, over that period. So there's a survey piece of it where we'll capture much of what I shared in that talk. There's also an interview component to it, and this speaks to my community roots as well, where I don't want to structure how students should appraise what we consider to be hardships. So a lot of what comes out through that interview is the opportunity for them to identify what's most significant without us saying, well, based on previous research, X, Y, and Z should be most impactful for you. And I think that's going to be a very, very rich set of data that will help us contextualize what we're finding with the quantitative reports.
Hey, Ciara, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you hope to disentangle the aspects of the environment versus the reactions of the person. Because I could imagine you could take two different people and put them in the same tough environment and they'll react differently. And vice versa. You could take, identical twins, as it were, and put them in different environments.
That's a great question. And, in many ways, it's one that Bronfenbrenner struggled with, right? That you can't do that entirely, especially with his revised model, this PPCT model. You really can't, because in this revision, the person, the way he's conceptualized the person includes their past experiences, includes demand characteristics like the skin that they're in, and how they appear to others. And so it's even harder to disentangle that way. What I am doing is identifying patterns. So instead of saying wholeheartedly we can disentangle the person from their microsystem, which is difficult, what we can do is understand how common appraisals might appear for certain subgroups. And that's one of the goals of this project, is to be able to look at trajectories over time, and to be able to look at patterns over time. Are there patterns of the way hardships may cluster together as perceived by certain subgroups, and to really understand how motivation may shift within those subgroups. So that will be my approach to trying to capture both of those. I think it's a great question.
If nobody else is jumping in, I was wondering the extent to which you might have the same individuals in different contexts. And so the extent to which you might be able to model context itself.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because context could be major, context could be A few different things. Tell me what you have in mind.
Well, I was wondering how you might define it, because when I see some of these theoretical models, they talk about context as a factor, but it can only be a factor insofar as we have variability, right? And so everybody at one institution shares that institutional context. But if we're talking about classrooms, then there's classroom contexts that vary. And so I'm just wondering how that figures into your thinking or your design.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about institutional, and that you're absolutely right. It's one of the reasons why I did not go with something with institutional characteristics that I thought would be static, because we don't have enough schools to test in that way. But we can assess students' perceptions of what their instructors believe. And there's evidence that that plays a role in how students assess and think about their own abilities. So that will certainly be a context that we look at. And that definitely be an example of a context that we look at, especially in STEM, where there's evidence that individuals are even more inclined to look externally for cues about how they will do if it's an area that they're not as confident in. So while we've talked about this institutionally, I can talk about another, which is related to their perceptions of themselves. So you heard me talk about in the previous study, mindsets, and that it didn't emerge with that study, but we touched back on it again here. It's not the focus here, but one of the things that I think will come out is how those mindsets might be associated with their motivation over time. And we'll be able to look at, let's say, the previous year's GPA, and is that serving as a significant predictor of a shift in their motivation? Is that offering some contextual information for the individual? So I think it'll be really eye-opening, and my goal is to use these data to inform strategies that universities can use, so that we really are creating the best environments for students when they come in. We can't control some of the hardships they can experience, but knowing the consistency of how these hardships predict attrition, we might be able to start shifting some of the strategies we're employing, so that students feel like they've got a chance to make it, to persist, irrespective of their hardship experience. That to me is what will widen our door for us to go beyond just saying we have numbers in terms of diversity, in terms of, like, we're going beyond demographic group membership, and now being able to expand into saying, not only do we have high numbers of individuals from different backgrounds, but we can also retain individuals with diverse hardship experiences. And that to me is what makes me excited about this project. It's what I want to be. It's the discourse I want to be able to contribute to.
Ciara, you've made us excited as well. I know you're busy talking and focusing on what you're doing, but you've gotten a whole string of highly complimentary and very interested comments in the chat as well. So I want to thank you again for taking the time to share this work with us. And boy, it's exciting. We could keep on talking about this for sure, and I look forward to hearing about your progress.